So welcome to our very first episode of Heads or Tails, and I'm delighted to welcome today the chairman of IAPS, Andrew Nott. I've known Andrew very well now for some time, and he's been a great support to Opperden. He is a bit of a guru, I would say, on best practice, and I can't think of anyone who really understands the independent sector as well as he might. He's worked very closely with teachers, with parents, and with children over a very impressive career as a head, and since then as a consultant. But I'd love to hear a little bit from you, Andrew, on your educational background before we get going on some questions.
Well, thank you for that very flattering introduction. I hope I live up to your expectations. So my own school career had a bit of a stop-start beginning. My first prep school, I lasted a week. I wasn't chucked out, but my mother tells me I was so unhappy that she removed me from that, moved me to another primary school, and I lasted slightly longer there, a couple of years, but probably like lots of 6, 7-year-old boys, was pretty idle and more interested in being outside. So they then sent me to prep school, and that probably between the ages of 7 and 13 was my most formative and important educational experience. I was at a school called the Beacon in Amersham. And I was very fortunate to be the recipient of a bursary. In fact, all throughout my school career, my father was a clergyman, and therefore not earning a huge salary. And I was really grateful, as were they, that the prep school and later on when I moved to King's Taunton after the Beacon gave them a significant bursary to enable me to go to those schools. I was then a boarder at King's Taunton, which was in those days a boys' school. After that, I read history at Swansea University, didn't want to be a teacher, just wanted to work in London, so worked in the civil service for nearly 7 years, and ultimately got really rather bored in my late 20s and got in touch with my former prep head, actually, from the Beacon, who was then head of St Andrews in Eastbourne. And he basically offered me a job, unqualified. I taught about 5 different subjects, lots of sport, then got a PGCE in post, and then became a housemaster at that school, and then eventually deputy head. So that was, I did that for 4 years. And then in 99, I moved to Daverney School, a boys' day school in Buckinghamshire, a school that went through to 13 standalone, and had 7 lovely years there. And we moved, by this time we had 5 children, all quite young. Sarah and I moved to St Hugh's in Oxfordshire, which is a co-ed boarding and day school, 3 to 13. And I left that a term before COVID hit. So with hindsight, not a bad time to leave. And since then I've been doing various different things, including currently chair of IPS. I run my own consultancy. I'm a governor of a few schools. And I do 1 or 2 other bits and pieces. So, enjoying the sort of cliched portfolio career, very much so indeed.
You could never accuse a teaching career of being one-dimensional, can you? All sorts of interesting snippets there from across those different experiences. And we'll try and dig into them a bit more. But heading back to when you were a boy, is there perhaps something that's one single big thing or something you can think of that you take from your experience in school that you'd wish for any child going through school today? Something you take from those early years?
I think the thing I really did love prep school. I enjoyed my senior school, but I suppose when I look back at those days, and one of the reasons for becoming a prep school teacher in the first place was to try and give back a bit to the schools I worked in, the sort of experience I had, because those were really reasonably carefree days. I was fortunate to be in a school that was very much an inclusive place, so it wasn't academically selective. It was comprehensive by intake, and there were others like me whose parents couldn't afford school fees, but we all did everything. It was a relatively small school, led by a really inspirational head who was a very kind person, and I think those sorts of values in the school really rubbed off on me and my friends, and those are the sorts of things I suppose when I became a head I wanted to make sure were part of this school's ethos. So I learned, funny enough, an awful lot about leadership through those early experiences in school, and obviously a lot later on by working for different people. But I suppose the service part of leadership probably did start when I was at prep school.
And when you were a boy and a teenager, did you feel you had someone in your life who was a mentor? Was that something that was hard to glean, or interested in your experiences around early mentorship?
It's a really good question, actually, because it as a concept, it probably wasn't even talked about in those days. And this is back in the sort of late 60s, early 70s. I suppose when I think back to that, mentors would have been probably members of the family, and throughout my life, people in my family, my father, my mother, I suppose, now certainly my most important mentor is probably my wife. But there have been professional mentors such as my prep head, contemporaries as well. But I suppose the relationships that we as pupils had with some of our teachers were the most formative and fundamental, and those were the ones who I suppose guided us best, us being children at school. And I suppose the same applied to my next school. But there was no formal mechanism for mentoring, and in a sense, if you were fortunate to be in a school which took seriously the personal development of children, then you were much more likely to have a really good experience. And I was. I'm very grateful to say.
And what value these days do you see in mentoring within schools? Has that understanding of mentoring changed, and if so, what value do you see now?
I think we now know so much more about young people, how they develop, where there are barriers to learning, how they are coping emotionally with the world around them. Whereas in the past we might label certain individuals attention seekers or idle, or fragile, or whatever the word may be. That was simply because we didn't really have a particularly good understanding, nor did we spend much time thinking about the pastoral and emotional needs of children. The world has changed completely now in all schools. So we do take much more seriously the well-being of young people, and that's now right at the forefront of our minds. So therefore schools have had to address that by making sure the teachers who work in the schools and the non-teaching staff have the necessary skills, that the leadership of the school sets the right example by looking after the people in the school, those people being those who work in the school as well as the children, and increasingly the relationships with parents mean that those issues are also at the forefront of our minds as educators. So I am grateful personally for whenever I'd had difficulties at school, people stepping in and dealing with them, and now I think we do that really, really well, to the point at which it consumes an awful lot of people's time, and increasingly we're having to appoint people to schools such as counsellors who didn't exist before. That work was done perhaps in a slightly haphazard way. Now there's much more formality to that, and the expectations of parents and schools and governors and the inspectorate mean that those things have to be done to the highest possible standards.
That was actually going to be my next question. I believe you're involved with ISI. Perhaps you could reflect a little bit on the changes to ISI and around the personal development and character framework.
Yes, I mean, having been an inspector for nearly, over 20 years now, I've seen the various iterations of the framework and how inspections have evolved. And in many ways, what used to happen quite a long time ago was more thorough, more developmental for a school, and certainly was all about school improvement. My concern moving forward, especially to the next framework, is that appears not to be a priority, and the educational standards and what is going on in the school, it seems to have been relegated down the order of what will be scrutinized. Clearly, pupil voice has an important place in inspection, and that has really very much been at the top of the agenda most recently, not least because of the various things like Everyone's Invited and Black Lives Matter, So schools are very much more in tune with what they need to do. My concern is that particular tail wags the dog, and that if everything is centered around pupil voice, we'll forget the other as important aspects of school life. That said, the development of character and the children's personal development should and does carry weight in inspections. And it's something which schools have, especially independent schools, have tended to do really, really well over the years, but actually previously hasn't been recognised or valued. Now it is. That my concern is that we potentially, if Framework 23 is as it might appear to be, tipping too much in one direction.
Really interesting. Thank you for that. I suppose we've been quite a little blinkered to start in terms of looking at the independent sector. Zooming out a bit, there are issues shared by both sectors and issues specific to those. Perhaps you could reflect just a little on what you see as the biggest challenges more nationally facing the education system.
I mean, we all face, whatever sector, challenges of cost. There are only a very small minority of schools for which recruitment of pupils is not an issue, and where their profitability is not a problem. The vast majority of schools, whether in the maintained sector or in the independent sector, are facing increasingly high costs, are needing to try to keep fee rises to a minimum to ensure that we continue to try to be accessible to as wide a range of families as possible. But that is really, really difficult. And what we're seeing also in both sectors, especially the maintained sector, is that it's harder to recruit heads, and some posts will remain unfilled in some state primary schools, for example. And in our sector, in IAPS, we know that the numbers of people putting themselves forward for headship is in decline. There's still people of really high caliber. And one of the things we're doing at IAPS, we have that pathway of leadership from aspirational young teachers to take on middle, and then obviously make sure people have throughout, which is a concern moving forward, because we want to make sure that there is a secure pipeline of the best possible people to run the schools around our country. There's nothing more important than those school leaders and senior leaders and teachers. And with budgets being so stretched as they are, that is certainly something which is going to be a challenge moving forward.
Thank you. I know it's a huge question with probably many different answers you could give to it. But if you did have the power, if you were able to affect some change in the short term, is there something really obvious that people are missing that frustrates you regularly as to how the sector could be improved?
I mean, I think it is a huge frustration. I have two siblings who work in the maintained sector, and we often share notes on different experiences. And we are fortunate in the independent sector not to have to abide by every new initiative that the DfE chooses to introduce, whereas obviously in the maintained sector that has to happen. Although increasingly through compliance, there is very little option for us to have to move in that direction. I suppose one frustration for all of us is the complete lack of continuity in the Department for Education and the Secretary of State. The numbers of changes that we've had in recent years has meant there has been no consistency, no continuity, and also not having people in those positions who have a significant educational background. When was the last time we had somebody who'd been a career teacher taking on that role? So that's something which would add significant credibility to that department, because I do feel there is a feeling that there's a disconnect between what is happening at government level and what is happening in schools. And no matter how one tries to communicate with government, it's very difficult to break through and to have influence on the direction of travel. So I suppose one thing I would try to do is to have whoever is in charge at that level to have education at the heart of their own background and experience, and if we find the right person, make sure they're in post for 4 or 5 years rather than 4 or 5 months.
Maybe more of an American model with someone selected and brought in by government. I guess it's a whole shake up to the very nature of government departments.
Exactly. It could be reflected across every department in an ideal world, but sadly we don't live in that ideal world.
As I have dipped my toe into this school world more and more in the past 2-3 years, I get the feeling that any change at government level is expected on an evolutionary rather than revolutionary basis. Nothing's going to happen very quickly, and if it does, it will take time and be frustrating, and many heads have to roll for real change to take place. With that context, what sort of a role do you think companies have, external to schools, providers? How do you see the landscape of provision to schools developing in the years to come?
Well, that's been fascinating. I mean, since I've been when I was first appointed head in '99, there was very little interaction between the commercial world and schools, and there was almost a visible wall between the two. Obviously, then with the advent of the internet and technology, we began to see 1 or 2 companies get involved in perhaps the hardware infrastructure of IT, but little else educationally. And then as time has moved on, so we've seen a huge proliferation of support services that add, in many cases, considerable value to schools. We also see EdTech at its best adding huge value to the learning and the teaching in schools. We're also seeing an awful lot more consultancy activity where schools perhaps can't afford to appoint a particular person to a particular job, will invest in some, hopefully high level consultancy to help them develop as schools. So that world has changed considerably, and as a head, we will reach out externally for support where we feel we need it. Whereas in the past, well, perhaps we didn't need it so much, but also we would have looked internally at non-specialists to do that. Marketing of a school is a good example, and many schools now who can afford it have a digital marketing officer who manages their social media feeds. Obviously, that's a brand new thing compared to how things were 20 years ago. But increasingly, these roles need to be conducted by specialists. And also we have lots of people coming in to support teachers, the curriculum, the personal development of children, careers development, you name it, there will be a service out there, to the point at which it's actually quite difficult sometimes for heads to work out where is the best provider. And that's where, IPS, for example, we act as a gatekeeper for schools and make sure our heads are informed about what's best practice out there and what providers might actually be really, really useful to them.
Thank you. I'm sure you're aware and have kept track of the Times Education Summit and that body of work that's taken place. The key thing I've taken from all of that is this gap between the working world and the world of education, and a bit of a skills gap that perhaps has always been there, or perhaps has got worse with the proliferation of sort of exams and hoops and hurdles that we need to jump over. Love to get your thoughts on the school system's focus on grades and how you think that focus on grades might increase or diminish or change in the years to come.
Well, I suppose to examine that, one needs to look a little bit back at the historical picture. And certainly, when I was at school, there was no real proper school inspection. There were no league tables, and there was little accountability if you happen not to be taught particularly well. And that's where actually inspection has benefited children's learning quite considerably. So one cannot get away with poor standards. One can argue that's gone to too much of an extreme, and the inspection model now is very different to how it used to be. So it's not about necessary school improvement as much as regulatory compliance. League tables have played their part, but again now I don't think are particularly helpful. for parents. But what we're seeing is a world in which the overall quality of teaching learning has risen considerably, and therefore, not surprisingly, grades have. But the other side of that coin is that where there is significant focus on GCSE and A-level grades and performance, necessarily there is less focus on the personal development of young people and those soft skills, perhaps, that employers often are craving and who they say are absent in many of the people that they recruit. And again, I think where we look at the children who come through independent schools, one of the opportunities, or one of the many opportunities they have, and the advantages they receive, is the whole co-curricular provision, and through drama and music and sport and art and all sorts of things that they have, and leadership opportunities. A lot will develop a level of confidence, the ability to present in public, because they have done an awful lot of that at schools. One of the things that I think is becoming a significant deficit in many children, especially the generation who've grown up with screens and sort of instant gratification on social media, is listening skills, which is something which probably the generation or two before our current generation of children possessed far better listening skills. And that's something that, certainly in primary and prep schools, we're very aware that we need to make sure we address. But we need people out in the world who have really good interpersonal skills, who can hold a conversation with lots of different people, who have the capacity to be empathetic, who will be able to adapt themselves to lots of different working environments and occupations, many of which don't now exist. And that requires a huge level of adaptability and resilience, and a mindset also that is very much a growth mindset, rather than somebody who comes with very fixed ideas about how the world around them should be, or what people should be like. Our children are entering a much more cosmopolitan world around them, which is fantastic, and they now mix and work with lots of people from lots of different backgrounds, whereas in the past perhaps that might have been not quite so prevalent in certain sectors, and that is absolutely a good thing. So we need to make sure our children are well prepared to have an inclusive attitude, for example, to understand others better, rather than just people from their own personal backgrounds. So it's happening, but it's absolutely vital that is a major focus, which it is in schools, and obviously, again, going back to resourcing, the better resourced you are, the easier it is for you to do that. But where schools are really stretched and teachers have expectations on them from parents and governors, it's less easy to carve out time to focus on those areas which we all know as adults are essential. But there's one thing knowing that something is really important, and there's another thing in actually making a change that you want to see.
That's all lovely and beautifully explained. You've sort of inadvertently answered my last question as well, but I'm going to come back to it. We're there on time now, so we've just got time for one more, and almost like a quick fire question. I'd like to take what you've said about skills, and you've sort of brought them into the values space as well. So we've discussed a bit of both skills and values. If you had to place, hand on heart, 2 or 3 values that you think were most important to instill in young people, as pithy as you can, I'd love to know what you'd circle in on from all that we've just discussed.
I mean, I have always felt, and this goes back to my own education and upbringing, that kindness is the most important value, because it pretty much covers everything. It covers integrity, which can be so lacking in public life that we now see, which is such an important essential quality in human beings. It covers effort and courage, and those are slightly old-fashioned. But I think if we can bring people up and they can develop in our schools and families as people who are kind, who are people of integrity, who have an open, inclusive attitude to those around them, who will try their hardest, who will listen to other people rather than speak first, and also who will hopefully have an attitude of service to others. And certainly in my upbringing, and certainly in the schools I have led, I've always wanted to remind the people in the schools, be they teachers or children, that the most important thing you can do is make a difference to the lives of others. There's lots of ways of doing that, and each of us will inevitably do it in a different way, but I suppose that underpins my own personal philosophy and values. But I would, if pushed for one word, it would be kindness.
Thank you. And I think that's a lovely place to stop. Andrew, really appreciate all your time today. Lots of very eloquent answers on some big topics that we could dig into in much more detail. It's been an interesting insight, and I really appreciate you sharing the time. So thank you very much.
Well, lovely to chat with you, Henry, and thank you for the opportunity.